They say what goes up must come down. Most of the time, that saying is just about gravity or the natural order of life. But what happens when something goes up and it doesn't come back down? That's exactly what I found out the night I pressed a button in an elevator that should not have existed. Imagine stepping into an elevator in a building you've worked in for years. You know every floor, every hallway, every corner. But one night, when you're heading home, you see something impossible. An extra button glowing softly where there shouldn't be one. Curiosity takes over. You press it. The elevator shutters, the lights flicker, and when the doors slide open, you're staring at a floor that doesn't exist on any blueprint. A forgotten hallway humming with faint electricity, stale air clinging to your lungs, and then the footsteps. Slow, deliberate, getting closer. You try to leave, but the elevator doors lock shut behind you. You are trapped. What I found on that missing floor didn't just change my life. It dragged me into a conspiracy that reached from my homeowners association all the way up to the FBI. And the worst part? Once you see it, you can never unsee it. Before I dive into what happened, I need to explain why this story matters and why it's not just about me. At first glance, this might sound like some urban legend, one of those spooky tales about haunted buildings or glitch in the matrix moments, but this was real, tangible, and the deeper I went, the clearer it became that this wasn't a simple case of a forgotten maintenance level or some overlooked construction blueprint. No, this was something designed, hidden, covered up deliberately. And the strangest part, the more I tried to figure it out, the more I realized that my homeowners association, the people who were supposed to manage my neighborhood, cut the grass, and enforce parking rules, were somehow involved in all of it. Sounds crazy, right? That's what I thought too. But everything I'm about to tell you is documented in the files I found, the warnings I received, and the people who suddenly disappeared when they started asking the wrong questions. When I moved into my condo, it was supposed to be a fresh start. A decent job, a predictable routine, and a safe community. The building itself wasn't fancy, but it was modern, clean, and well kept. 6 floors in total, offices, apartments, and a couple of restricted areas for maintenance. I never thought much about it. But then came the notices from the HOA. Small things at first. Letters about minor violations, questions about my comings and goings, even suggestions about who I should or shouldn't associate with in the building. At first, I brushed it off as overzealous management. Annoying, sure, but not unusual, until the elevator incident. That single glowing button changed everything. It showed me that there was more to my building than I'd ever realized. That someone, maybe the HOA, maybe someone higher, was watching, planning, and keeping secrets beneath the surface. And once I uncovered the truth, I understood why they wanted me gone. This isn't just about one missing floor. It's about the hidden structures of control that sit right beneath our feet, invisible until the wrong person stumbles onto them. And I was that wrong person. So here's how it all began. It started on a Wednesday night. Nothing special about it, just another long day at work. I stayed late finishing some reports, long after most of the building had emptied out. By the time I packed up, the hallways were silent, the fluorescent lights buzzing faintly overhead. I stepped into the elevator on the 6th floor, yawning, ready to head home. The panel lit up, and that's when I saw it. Floor 7, I froze. I had worked here for nearly 3 years. The building had 6 floors. 6. I knew this because when I first moved in, I'd even looked up the property records online. The blueprints were public. 6 floors plus a basement for storage and maintenance. That was it. But now, right in front of me, the number 7 glowed like it had always been there. At first, I thought I was just exhausted, maybe misreading the light. I blinked, rubbed my eyes. No, it was real. The button was there, pulsing faintly in the dim light of the elevator. I told myself not to touch it, that it was none of my business. Maybe some kind of repair system or a prank, maybe even a glitch. But my finger hovered anyway, and then I pressed it. The elevator groaned as if reluctant to move. The floor indicator climbed past 6, flickered, then showed 7. My stomach tightened. The machine stopped with a jolt. The lights dimmed and the doors slid open. What I saw made my skin crawl. The hallway stretched out before me, dimly lit by humming fluorescent bulbs. The walls were older than the rest of the building, stained with watermarks, patched with peeling paint. It didn't look abandoned exactly, but it definitely didn't look like any other part of the building. I stepped forward cautiously, My shoes echoed against the concrete floor. There were doors on either side, each labeled with faded stencils. Storage, records, access. And then I heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, somewhere deeper down the hallway. I spun back to the elevator, but the doors had already closed. My finger mashed the button over and over, but nothing happened. Panic prickled the back of my neck. I had two choices. Wait there for whoever or whatever was coming, or move. I chose to move. The first door I tried was locked. The second opened with a squeal of rusted hinges. Inside was a small office-like space, filled with metal filing cabinets. Dust motes floated in the air, disturbed by my sudden intrusion. Against my better judgment, I pulled one of the drawers open. My eyes skimmed the labels. Resident profiles, behavioral reports, surveillance logs. I froze when I saw my own name. There it was, typed neatly on a file tab. Inside were photographs of me leaving my apartment, timestamps of when I used the laundry room, even notes about conversations I'd had with neighbors. My heart pounded in my ears. This wasn't normal building management. This was surveillance. Obsessive, invasive surveillance. I shoved a handful of files into my bag without thinking. I didn't know why. Instinct, maybe. Proof. Evidence. Something told me I'd need it. Then the footsteps grew louder. I slammed the drawer shut and ducked back into the hallway. Whoever it was, they were close now. Too close. I could hear the scuff of their shoes, the faint rhythm of their breathing. The elevator doors finally creaked open with a ding that felt deafening in the silence. I ran, leapt inside, and punched the lobby button. The doors slid shut just as a shadow rounded the corner. My chest heaved as the elevator descended. When it stopped, the panel displayed 1. The doors opened to the empty lobby. Everything looked perfectly normal, as though nothing had happened, but I knew better. The next morning, there was a notice taped to my door. Unauthorized access detected. Residents must refrain from tampering with restricted building areas. Violators will be removed. There was no signature, just the official HOA seal. I stared at it for a long time. How did they know? Cameras, maybe. But even then, how could they know I'd gone to a floor that officially didn't exist? My hand shook as I crumpled the paper. That's when I realized I wasn't just trespassing. I was in the middle of something much bigger than me. That night I barely slept. My mind kept replaying the sound of those footsteps, the sight of my own file in that cabinet. And then around 2 a.m., I heard something outside my window. A whisper. A rustle. I pulled the curtain back just in time to see a figure standing across the street staring up at my apartment. When I blinked, they were gone. But deep down, I knew. They weren't gone. They were watching, and the files I'd taken had just made me their target. The morning after I saw that figure outside my window, I tried to convince myself it was just paranoia. Maybe a trick of the streetlights. Maybe my imagination. But the feeling of being watched never left me. And then the letters started. At first, they were slipped under my door, short, typed notes on plain white paper. Return what you took. Do not go back upstairs. You are being monitored. Each note had no signature, no handwriting, just blocky black text. But the last one chilled me most. You don't belong here anymore. I showed them to a neighbor I trusted, a woman named Karen who lived 2 floors below. She frowned, glanced nervously at the hallway cameras, and whispered, "You shouldn't talk about this. Not out here. Not at all." When I pressed her, she only said one thing. "They don't like people who ask questions." And then she closed the door in my face. That was the moment I realized I wasn't imagining it. The entire building, the HOA, the management, maybe even some of my neighbors, were part of something I couldn't yet see. Against every instinct screaming at me not to. I knew I had to go back the first time I'd been caught off guard. But this time I'd come prepared. Phone camera ready, flashlight in my pocket, and a plan to grab more evidence. Late that night, I slipped into the elevator again. My heart raced as the panel lit up. For a second, I thought the button might not appear, that maybe it had been some hallucination, a trick of fatigue. But there it was. Glowing faintly like it was waiting for me, I pressed it. The elevator groaned. And once again, the doors opened onto that dim corridor. Only this time, the smell was different, damp, metallic, like rust and mold mixed with something sharper, something that made my stomach turn. I forced myself forward, filming everything. The signs, the doors, the cabinets. But deeper down the hall, I noticed something I hadn't before. A stairwell door. It wasn't locked. Curiosity drove me down into darkness. My flashlight beam cut through dust and cobwebs, revealing rough stone walls instead of concrete. These weren't maintenance tunnels. These were older. Much older. The staircase spiraled downward until it ended at a heavy steel door. On it was a faded warning. Property of management. To not enter. My hand shook as I pushed it open. Behind it stretched a tunnel. Long, narrow, leading into pitch black, and then I heard something from inside, a cough. Human, close. I didn't wait. I bolted back up the stairs, through the hallway, and into the elevator. But when the doors slid shut, I realized I wasn't alone. A man in a dark suit stood in the corner of the elevator, staring at me without blinking. "You shouldn't have seen that," he said softly. I froze. My thumb hovered over the emergency button, but before I could press it, the lights flickered and the man was gone. Just gone. When the doors opened to the lobby, I stumbled out shaking. Had I hallucinated him, or was he real? I didn't know, but one thing was certain: I wasn't safe anymore. The next day, I came home to find my front door unlocked. Inside, nothing was stolen. Nothing was broken, but everything was wrong. My papers were slightly rearranged. My drawers had been opened. Even the files I'd taken from the missing floor had been moved, as though someone had gone through them carefully and deliberately. They wanted me to know they'd been inside. And sure enough, there was another notice taped to the wall. Final warning, stop. I couldn't stay silent anymore. That's when I made the call. I dialed the local FBI field office, expecting laughter or disbelief. Instead, the moment I mentioned unauthorized surveillance and missing floor, the line went quiet. Then the agent asked me to come in. When I arrived, 2 plainclothes agents led me into a windowless room. They spread the files I'd stolen across the table, studying them carefully. One of them looked up at me, his expression unreadable. "Where did you get these?" I explained everything: the button, the hidden floor, the tunnels. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Then the older agent leaned forward. "That floor was decommissioned decades ago. Officially, it doesn't exist." My stomach dropped. "Then how was I there last night?" The agent's eyes darkened. "If you were there, then you're in more danger than you realize." Over the next week, the FBI placed me under what they called informal protection. Agents would occasionally shadow me, though they didn't make it obvious. They told me to keep living normally, to not provoke the HOA, and to keep any evidence I found coming directly to them. But the HOA noticed. Neighbors who used to greet me suddenly avoided eye contact. The building staff became cold, unhelpful, and every night, I'd see shadows moving in the hallway outside my door. Then one evening, Karen, the neighbor who had once warned me to stop asking questions, came to me in tears. "They know you've been talking to them," she whispered. "You have to leave, please, before it's too late." I begged her to explain. She only said, "The people who disappear, they're not coming back, and if you stay, you'll be next." Eventually, the FBI decided to act. One night, they brought me along. Maybe to verify what I'd seen, maybe because they knew I was already too deep to back out. We entered the building after midnight. 4 agents in tactical gear, silent and efficient. They forced the elevator open and reactivated the 7th floor sequence. When the door slid open, my breath caught. The corridor was different, cleaner, brighter, like it had been scrubbed and repaired. But the cabinets were still there. And so were the tunnels. The agents spread out, searching rooms. One of them pried open a cabinet drawer and froze. Inside were dozens of files marked "Removed Residents." Each listed a name, a date, and a status. "Relocated." But the agent shook his head. "They weren't relocated," he whispered. "They vanished, and now we know where." Before I could ask what he meant, alarms blared. Red lights flashed overhead. Metal shutters slammed down across the hallway. We were trapped. Shadows emerged from the tunnel entrance. Figures in dark uniforms, their faces obscured. They moved with precision, flanking the agents, cutting us off. Gunfire erupted. The sound was deafening in the narrow corridor. Agents returned fire, yelling for me to get back. I ducked behind a cabinet, clutching the stolen files to my chest. My ears rang, my heart pounded. Through the chaos, one of the attackers lunged at me. His eyes were cold, mechanical, as though he wasn't fully human. He swung wildly, shoving him back into the darkness. That's when I realized these weren't just HOA enforcers. This was something bigger, organized, militarized, and I was in the middle of it. The firefight raged, but suddenly, silence. I peeked out. The agents were gone. The attackers were gone. The hallway was empty, except for me, but the elevator panel no longer showed lobby. Instead, the glowing number read B2. The doors slid open, revealing a stairwell that plunged deeper underground than I thought possible, and a voice crackled over hidden speakers. You wanted answers. Now come and see. I froze at the threshold, because whatever waited for me below was the truth behind everything. The HOA, the missing floor, the disappearances, and I had no choice but to step inside. The elevator doors closed behind me, locking with a mechanical clang. I gripped my flashlight tight and started down the stairwell into basement level 2, a place that didn't appear on any blueprint, lease agreement, or inspection record. The air grew colder, damp with mildew and iron. My footsteps echoed like I wasn't alone, though every time I spun my light around, there was no one there. At the bottom was a reinforced door with a retinal scanner, but the lock had already been forced open, wires dangling. Someone wanted me to come through. When I pushed the door, it groaned open to reveal a massive underground chamber. Rows of filing cabinets stretched into the distance. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, illuminating tables stacked with old computers, reels of surveillance tapes, and most horrifying of all, walls covered in resident photographs. Hundreds of them. Families, children, people I recognized from my own neighborhood, and above them, in red paint, a single word. Removed. A sound made me spin. From behind a row of cabinets stepped a woman, disheveled, pale, but very much alive. Behind her came more figures, men and women, gaunt and terrified, clutching each other. You're not with them, she whispered. I shook my head, stunned. Who are you? She swallowed. We're the ones who disappeared. My blood went cold. These were the names in the files, the relocated residents. They hadn't been killed. They'd been hidden down here. Why? I asked. Her eyes darted upward toward the ceiling. They said it was for control. That the HOA, the management, needed compliance. Anyone who resisted was brought down here. Before I could respond, a heavy clank echoed through the chamber. Doors were locking. They knew I was here. Suddenly, floodlights snapped on, blinding me. A line of men in suits stepped forward, faces familiar from the HOA board. At their center was a tall, sharp-featured man I recognized instantly, Mr. Callahan, the HOA president. You just couldn't leave it alone, could you? He sneered. The 7th floor, the files, the tunnels. You had to keep digging. I shouted back. You're imprisoning your own residents. For what, control? He smiled coldly. Not just control, containment. He gestured to the survivors, huddled in fear. They were infected. They saw too much, learned too much. We couldn't let them roam free. So we built a place for them. A floor that doesn't exist. A basement no one questions. My stomach turned. That's insane. The FBI knows everything now. They'll shut you down. But Callahan only chuckled. You think the FBI isn't part of this? Half the agents you spoke to are ours. The rest, well, they won't survive long enough to expose us. As if on cue, the chamber doors burst open. FBI agents stormed in, weapons drawn. For a moment, relief washed over me. But then I saw it. Their badges weren't real. Their movements too stiff, too rehearsed. These weren't FBI. They were HOA enforcers dressed as federal agents. The survivors screamed. Callahan raised his hand and the imposters advanced. And that's when real gunfire cut through the air. From the far side of the chamber, a second squad of FBI agents stormed in, this time unmistakably genuine. Chaos erupted. Bullets flew. Cabinets toppled. Survivors scrambled for cover. And in the middle of it, I ducked behind a table, clutching the files tighter. For the first time, the truth was clear. The HOA wasn't just a neighborhood nuisance. It was a network, a shadow government infiltrating federal agencies, manipulating communities, disappearing anyone who stood in their way. And now, the FBI was finally fighting back. One of the real agents grabbed my arm, shouting over the chaos. Take them! Get the survivors out. We sprinted toward a service tunnel, leading the terrified residents behind us. The walls shook from the firefight, dust raining from the ceiling. As we neared the exit, a deafening roar echoed through the chamber. I looked back just in time to see Callahan at the center of the chaos, calmly raising a small device. He pressed it, and the entire chamber began to collapse. Steel beams groaned, lights shattered. The floor buckled. We barely made it through the tunnel before the ceiling caved in, sealing Callahan and his empire beneath tons of concrete. In the weeks that followed, the FBI quietly relocated the survivors. Publicly, the incident was buried, labeled as structural failure in the building. No mention of the missing floor, the underground prison, or the HOA conspiracy. They told me to stay quiet, to forget what I'd seen, but I couldn't. Everywhere I went, I started noticing things. Unmarked cars idling near my street, new neighbors moving in overnight, HOA notices appearing in places I didn't even live. It wasn't just my building. This was happening everywhere. One of the real agents grabbed my arm, shouting over the chaos, "Take them! Get the survivors out!" We sprinted toward a service tunnel, leading the terrified residents behind us. The walls shook from the firefight, dust raining from the ceiling. As we neared the exit, a deafening roar echoed through the chamber. I looked back just in time to see Callahan at the center of the chaos, calmly raising a small device. He pressed it, and the entire chamber began to collapse. Steel beams groaned, lights shattered. The floor buckled. We barely made it through the tunnel before the ceiling caved in, sealing Callahan and his empire beneath tons of concrete. In the weeks that followed, the FBI quietly relocated the survivors. Publicly, the incident was buried, labeled as structural failure in the building. No mention of the missing floor, the underground prison, or the HOA conspiracy. They told me to stay quiet, to forget what I'd seen, but I couldn't. Everywhere I went, I started noticing things. Unmarked cars idling near my street, new neighbors moving in overnight, HOA notices appearing in places I didn't even live. It wasn't just my building. This was happening everywhere. One evening, months later, I stepped into the elevator of a different building across town. The panel lit up. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and then, suddenly glowing faintly as though it had been waiting for me all along. My stomach dropped. My hand hovered over the button, and then the lights flickered, and a voice whispered from the speaker. "You can't escape us." The button pulsed once, like a heartbeat, and I realized the fight wasn't over, not even close.